in response to India continuing to buy Russian oil despite US efforts to pressure Moscow. Bessent said that the 25% tariff has been a huge success, noting Indian imports of Russian oil have collapsed. He also added that India, the world's third largest oil importer, has significantly reduced Russian oil purchases, opening the door for a possible recalibration of US trade policy. I welcome now Dr. Jayajit Bhattacharya, economist and policy expert from New Delhi, in this discussion. Dr. Bhattacharya, thanks very much for joining us. Of course, it's a welcome news, but what do you think has triggered it? The statement that has come in as saying that the oil imports from Russia has collapsed. That, of course, is not entirely true. India will continue to purchase oil and gas from wherever it gets it the cheapest from. But what other reasons are there for this reduction of tariff? Of course, we know also after Trump at Davos praised Prime Minister Modi and said a trade deal could be arrived on really soon.
I think the US was basically looking for an excuse to get themselves out of a very bad situation that they had got into by putting this tariff against India. It has impacted in the cost of goods going up in US. I'm really not sure whether we should believe in the inflation numbers that were given for the previous year, because whenever we speak to people on the ground, there seems to be very significant inflation. And which is also one of the reasons why we see that the growth numbers in the US seems to be a little unbelievably high, because the real growth is calculated by subtracting the inflation rate from the nominal growth. So if the inflation rate is kept down by whatever technique, the real growth looks pretty good at 4.2%. But I don't believe that that's really what's happening. And with a barrage of adversaries created by the US administration because of their steps taken in relation to Greenland, in relation to Europe, and in relation to India, they seem to have been cornered. So what we are seeing as a global geoeconomic development is that the world is getting fractured between the US economy and the non-US economies. This was what was happening during the Cold War, where it was the Western economies versus the communist economies. Now it's changing into the US economies versus non-US economies, and that really is not good for the US. And India being one of the fastest growing markets in the world, and with EU having their, giving the overtures to India for signing what has been called by the EU president as the mother of all deals, US needs to get their act together and get into the room and have that conversation with India. And clearly, you can't have a conversation if there is very limiting tariffs that have been put onto India, 50% plus kind of tariff, which essentially meant that India just could not do any trade.
Yeah.
Now, with the change that's happening, if the 25% tariff is removed, one of the impacts that will clearly happen is the strengthening of the rupee. We have seen in the recent past how the rupee got devalued in a very short period of time. With this relief coming in, I believe that the rupee will also become stronger as we move forward.
All right. Would you say, Dr. Bhattacharya, that these tariffs is also now, the US has moved to reduce these tariffs if it does, although hasn't yet already, but if it does, is also to have better prospects for Donald Trump ahead of the midterms, because US would indeed want better ties with its allies and have its economy in a good space as Trump will undergo these tests.
Yeah, as we all know that in most democracies, people don't vote based on geopolitics, but they vote based on actual economics and the cost of goods and jobs, and those are the factors which drive them.
Yeah.
And so if the US administration is able to close a deal with India much before the midterm elections, which is just looming, and so that they can see the benefit of that deal coming in and soothing the prices in India, in the US, only then there is a benefit. I kind of believe that it's a little late in the day to make that change in order to appease their domestic audience, but one never knows what is really the driver. For example, steel, textile, electrical machinery, these are all become much more expensive in US because India has stopped exporting it and because of the tariffs. So there are multiple, products that are very key to the economy whose prices have gone up in US. And if they are able to sign the deal even by March, if they start now and sign the deal by March, its impact will come, much after the elections would have happened.
Yeah.
So perhaps we are looking at a much longer term basis, but also the fact that US has lost many of its allies, especially from an economic perspective.
And how do you assess the fact that US is also now going to drop tariff threats on Europe amidst all of this? Trump had imposed all these tariffs, on the excuse of trade imbalances, and then to go on with his geopolitical ambitions, whether it was on towards Venezuela or Greenland, and he then or Russia. He went on to impose these tariffs, but the question of the trade imbalances, how has that been really addressed? Because that was the primary reason that Trump had stated for imposing these tariffs.
See, primarily and fundamentally, the reason why trade imbalances happen is if one of the economies is weaker, and therefore they do not have enough to offer. The second reason why trade imbalances happen is because of predatory pricing and non-level playing field, where you create non-tariff trade barriers so that your goods can't be sold to another geography. Now, in case of US, there was no non-tariff trade barrier. All goods from US is more than welcome, but still you will see, if you look at it from an India perspective, there is no single US car, the American car, being sold in India. In fact, there are no bikes also that are being sold in India. It's only when they started partnering with Indian bike makers that they are able to at least bring a bike that is acceptable in the market.
Yeah.
But there's very little footprint of one of the largest industries of the US, which is the automobile industry. Even Tesla, which is supposed to be the poster boy of automobiles in the US, has not been able to sell anything in India. So this is not because countries are stopping
electronic vehicle sales are even dropping in the US itself.
Absolutely. So the larger point is that the US industry has weakened in relation to the rest of the world. So therefore, putting up tariffs is something that developing economies do. It doesn't behove developed economies to put up such large tariffs, and that is what WTO was about. That is what the GATT negotiations were about. And if you come back and see that the US is behaving like a developing economy, then that's a sign that the industries in the US are getting weaker, which is quite a challenge, because clearly in certain areas the US is actually still very strong. It needs to pull up its socks on other industries, but that can't happen by putting up tariffs. It has to happen through other mechanisms where they actually strengthen their supply chains, reduce their cost of production, reduce their cost of food, for example, which is just skyrocketed right now, and just make it better for their industries to compete. So there has to be a different response from the US rather than being a defensive response, which is what they are showing right now.
All right. Doctor, thanks for your comments. I requested to stay on as we proceed now. Viewers, India and the European Union are expected also to announce the conclusion of lengthy